The four men are gathering in the parlor. Their talk is short, their voice is quiet. So quiet I can barely make out what they're saying. Although the sadness in one of them is so strong I can feel it emanating from him like an aura. My vision of them isn't particularly clear, of course, but how could it be when you're looking through a hole in the wall the size of a tennis ball? When the men first arrived at the house, I'd been waiting for them in the attic. But I soon began to shuffle through the walls in search of a better vantage point. There were vermin, of course, huge hordes of them, both terrestrial and otherworldly, but they dared not come near me. Even with their most rudimentary intelligence, they knew my kind are not to be touched. I pull out my pocket watch and feel the gold chain wrapped around my clenched fist, savoring its cold touch, its perfect craftsmanship, its nigh indestructibility. Most of my kind have moved on to digital wristwatch, and some are even toying with other more bizarre creations for tracking the course of events, but I prefer the simple elegance of this archaic device. It's much more on the inside, mind you, but if anyone were to see me, they would see only something retro. Silently, I clip the top and the cover flips open. I steal a quick glance from the watch to the four men, then back to the watch again. Plenty of time left. It seems I got here much earlier than anticipated. About a day too early for the first, and my job won't be done for a few more days after that. So, what am I to do with this spare time on my hands? Before I joined my kind, back when I was limited and yet paradoxically free, I enjoyed storytelling. Oh, the yarns I would spin, the words I could utilize. I can't guarantee those skills still reside in my bones, despite my bones being only apparent. But I have nothing to do. So, why don't you sit down? And I'll tell you one of my favorite tragedies. Whoops. Did I just ruin the ending? Too bad. I'll continue anyways. Zackstown had developed into chaos. King's End, the little settlement, which had evolved over the centuries, was finally imploding. It had, in those intervening times between the laying of its foundation and the closing of its casket, stretched itself into the dark woods which surrounded it. Trees were removed to make way for streets, houses, and buildings of all manners. But, though the heavily shadowed forest had been steadily ebbed away, the darkness which it contained had remained. Strange entities moved in that town, and now an old darkness, which the townsmen of generations past had overcome, was resurfacing with a deadly ferocity. The young man refused to acknowledge the illness by the term Hollywood had overused, zombie, but it seemed frustratingly the most applicable moniker. Those of King's Inn were going mad, dying and then returning to life, if life is what you could call it, with the sole intent of consuming the living. The boy with the dirty blonde hair knew the roads would be congested. He envisioned them shut down and gridlocked by everyone trying to flee, so those exits would be out of the question. He also couldn't go through the woods for fear of whatever carnivores may be residing in there, and even if those rumors were only rumors, it would still be days of hiking through a forest before reaching the nearest town. Such a trek would require far more preparation than Zack had time to enact. So, that left the swamp, the muck, the home of alligators. If those rumors were not rumors only, swimming would, of course, mean almost certain death through consumption or disease. But Zack had a hope in mind. He knew of a place where a few local scumbuckets kept a pair of canoes. If he could make it out there, to their lone dock, then take off in one of their canoes before they made it there themselves, he might be able to venture out into the swamp and then towards the nearby town. Luck initially seemed to be on his side that evening, for his venture into the forest brought him face to face with no dangers, neither mad or carnivorous, nor sane and carnivorous. Of course, he heard some terrifying things. Shrieks, cries, howls at the moon. It was like the forest itself had drifted into madness, but never did it try and reach out to snatch him away, even when it stared through glowing, silvery eyes which chilled him to the bone. His luck ran out when he reached the dock. There were no canoes there. He heard there were two, a metal one and a wooden one, but both were conspicuously absent from their vacant dock. He passed an abandoned car not far from there, so he could only assume that its driver and passengers had beaten him to the dock and taken off without him. Zack stood there, dumbfounded, trying to troubleshoot his problem and find a plausible solution. But there had to be one. This was no unwinnable scenario, but as he stood there, he heard the screams from the forest begin to drift closer, and those silvery glowing orbs that hid in the shadows were creeping ever nearer. He looked up and saw the clouds drifting away like a sheet, and let through the light of a full moon. And in the light, he could see shambling forms encroaching upon the dock. He was able to run before he realized that they cut off his escape path. There was no way to get off the dock without running into the shamblers head on. And as he watched in horror, one rotting body, black skin shining against the pale white eyes, shuffled out onto the dock. Clawed hands stretched out before it, grasping after him. It came closer and closer, and Zack backed away, but as his heart pounded in his chest, he miscalculated his free space, tripped, and tumbled backwards into the dark, lukewarm waters of the Machina swamp. He looked up at those pale eyes, knowing that he could never climb back on the dock on their account. And then, the other multitude of other forms, some shambling like the one on the dock, others seeming to float in the shadow beneath glowing silver eyes, lining the shore as if waiting for him to march straight into their grasp. Alas, the only safety left was to swim out deeper into the swamp, and that was certainly far from safe. But he did it anyways. He swam slowly and carefully, wading where he could, always trying to mind his surroundings. About 2/3 of a mile in, by his estimation, he moved over to a nearby tree and climbed up on its roots, pulling his soaked and grimy feet from the thick waters. He needed a break, and he wanted to gauge his surroundings for potential reptilian danger. One of the tree branches, bare and sickly like the town itself, evaded his caution and drew a thin scratch against his cheek. Angrily, he snapped the branch off and tossed it into the swamp, and then wiped the trickle of blood from his face onto his sleeve of his shirt. He swam again for a long while, but eventually took another break and climbed more cautiously onto another tree's roots when he felt himself growing nauseated. His cheek was also burning, and he was starting to feel dizzy and disoriented. He must have gotten infected, he told himself as he touched the dried blood on his cheek. It is a swamp after all. I'll need some antibiotics when I get out of here. As Zack thought on these concerns, his eyes were drawn to some moving logs nearby. The rough bark drifting lazily through the waters, illumined by whatever pitiful light could penetrate the thick canopy above his head. They're just logs, he told himself, and then even dared to speak the words aloud, though the sound of his own voice in the now eerily silent swamp only served to unnerve him all the more. He heard the rumors of alligators out here, beasts of enormous proportions, but like all the rumors, he doubted that they could actually prove true. Alligators had never been this far north, and even if some were displaced in this muckhole, the swamp would never have provided enough of a diet for them to survive on, let alone thrive to megalithic proportions. It was impossible. But then again, he'd also dismissed the notion of banshees in the forest who floated with glowing eyes. And he'd also dismissed the idea of some sort of zombie virus that had plagued the town centuries beforehand. No, he told himself, impossible. There's no evidence to support it. As if in response to this exact line of thought, one of the logs drifted right up to Zack, and he could see in the dark the smooth contours closest to him. And he observed how the log tapered off in the opposite direction as a tail would have done. Reacting only on gut instinct, Zack shifted his weight to his right side and flipped into the water just as the log shot out of it. And before he sank into the waters, he heard the snapping of a massive, powerful jaws that clamped down in the exact spot where he had just been crouching on the roots. He evaded one of the creatures in the swamp, and he was momentarily grateful for that. That gratitude was short-lived, though, as another great dark form shot towards him just beneath the surface. Another jaw snapped onto his torso, his body erupting in pain as he screamed and tasted copper, as if the water around him was filled with it. And then something very odd began to happen. The jaws that held him seemed to melt away into the swamp, vanishing completely, only to be replaced with an even odder netting of thick rope. He couldn't move, his own weight pulling him down as the net around him pulled him upwards. After only a few seconds, he broke the surface, inhaling the air with gratitude, even greater than the instinct which had saved him from the first reptile. He felt himself dragged, still inside of the webbed net, over the gunwale of a boat and dropped harshly onto a humming deck. All of this left him with far more questions. A few of these were answered when the net was cut away and Zach saw... It was bright morning now, and the four men are outside, walking slowly through the mansion's cemetery. I'm watching through the upstairs windows, knowing that they won't think to look up here and see me, or even if they did, the glare from the east morning sun would obscure their vision. Ah, my story? Well, we'll get back to that momentarily, so don't you worry yourself. The men are roaming through the cemetery, moving slowly, purposelessly. One of them stops in a large crypt in the center, charcoal black miniature of a mausoleum. Calls for the others, and together, they puzzle over something etched onto the opening. Oh, how I wish they would heed the warning and not open the crypt, for I know what waits inside. But even as one of the men grasps the handles and shatters the beam which bars the door, there is no lock upon it, mind you. I can see a shadow cast from within, and in the darkness, something flits out into the morning sun. None of them can see it, of course, but I can. I've seen it before, or rather, felt its cruel curse. It senses the four men, seems to take them in, not only their sights and sounds, but their very fateful souls, and then vanishes into the depths and shadows of the cemetery. If only they had left the crypt shut. If only that thing within it had remained in that prison. Then their lives would still be their own, and their town would not soon fall to this terrible fate. But if they hadn't taken this first step, then I wouldn't be here for them, now would I? And Zach would have not run so callously into the swamp to face his strange fate. Speaking of which, I may as well get back to my story. My pocket watch tells me there's still plenty of time. Zach was lying in the bottom of a ship. It was old and worn black, and some of the wooden planks that looked to have grown over with mold while others were rotted away completely. And yet it was still afloat, like some unsinkable, festering whaling vessel which refused to rest on the sea floor. The men on board are a scrappy-looking bunch, their clothes ragged, torn in some places, the stink of the unwashed emanating from all of them. Of course, they just pulled Zach out of a swamp, so he wouldn't be the one to complain about a particularly heinous odor. One man had a tan fisherman's hat, complete with lures around the fan. Another had a notably elongated handlebar mustache. The sailors, or whalers, simply turned their backs and resumed their various labors, as if a single glance at the young man they'd hauled aboard in their nets was all they needed to satisfy their bizarrely muted curiosity. The net was stripped away by a tubby man in a t-shirt that seemed too small for his midsection. But the most he would say to Zach was, "Move off," while he worked and packed away the ropes. The startled young man tried asking the men what was going on, how they could get such a large ship to move through the swamp, totally crowded with trees, but they were all of them wholly uninterested. Zach scrambled to his feet, tried again. The more he tried, the more he realized that these men weren't displaying a simple disinterest. They were being downright evasive. Aggravated and disoriented, he froze when he stepped up to the splintered old gunwale and saw what lay beyond the ship. It was no longer a swamp at all, but some black and terrible sea. The dark waters that lapped below their feet were lit only faintly by the cold, unblinking stars overhead, with neither moon nor sun anywhere to be found. But neither were there trees, or outgrowths, or riverbanks, or anything but those endlessly cold waves which rolled, pitched like charcoal. "Where are we?" Zach asked aloud. The only response he got was from the man with the handlebar mustache, who yanked him roughly back from the edge. "You're our link," he said. "Now don't you go falling overboard, huh?" "What does that mean?" Zach begged, growing exasperated. 2 minutes ago, I was being attacked by an alligator, and now I'm suddenly in a ship out in the ocean? What the hell's going on? "Hell's got nothing to do with it," the man with the fisherman's hat said. "Who knows? It might," came a cackle from the handlebar mustache. Frustrated and wanting to throttle the men, Zach took a deep breath and noticed a light coming from behind a nearby doorway. He opened it and found a descending passageway leading below deck, down some steps and into the galley in the belly of the ship. Concluding that he'd get no straight answers from the sailors on deck, he dared to venture down below, and so he followed after that dim light. The farthest room was indeed the crew's mess hall. It was empty except for a few lanterns which were lit, and a light from around a bin that he assumed led to the kitchen and scullery. Seeing nothing of interest here, he backed up and began opening some of the doors along the hallway. Some were full of random storage, and 2 held hammocks and personal effects. The 6th room glanced into piqued his interest. It was a room seemingly empty except for a table on which sat a minuscule collection of arcane books. Each of them was faded and leather-bound with golden lettering that was never fully visible. They were of varying sizes and thickness, but they each reminded him of a section of his hometown library. There was some select books that the King's Inn Library held in stock, which, for reasons unknown to Zach, the enigmatic librarian never allowed anyone to access. And, being the only librarian in a small town, she was allowed to withhold those books, much to the chagrin of a mind as keen and curious as his own. But he'd seen the books from a distance, glanced at them from the end of a long hallway, and those very codices came to mind when he saw those dusty old tomes riding his cargo across this queer ship. Unable to restrain himself, he reached out to touch one of them. It felt warm in his hands, as if it had been handled by 1,000 people immediately before him, and yet it didn't feel as worn as such a book should. It felt strong, durable, nigh indestructible, like he couldn't tear a page from it, even if he wanted to. And as he began to scroll through the pages, a sense of power began to emanate from them. One image after another seemed to dance before his eyes, arcane imagery hovering in the air and drifting through his consciousness in such a way that he wasn't reading the book so much as he was experiencing it, the way one would experience a movie on the big screen. "It makes sense that you'd find those right off the bat," a voice said from the doorway. Startled, Zach slammed the book shut and turned his heel. There was a clean-shaven man standing in the doorway, wearing a raincoat that looked highly reminiscent of detective noir garb. Zach wouldn't have been surprised to discover that the man had a magnifying glass and a revolver in his pockets. "The men up there, they won't talk to you, will they?" Zach shook his head and cleared his throat. "What's going on here?" "Well, let's see what you can decipher already," the man nodded towards the book. "You stole these from the library, didn't you?" The man nodded. "And you're getting away by taking an old ship through a swamp? How's that possible?" The man smiled wryly and held out his hand. "Name's Galloway. And before you think it, I don't want to hear any jokes about Galloway in the gallery. They're not annoying. I've just heard them all. You must be the link." Zach cautiously reached out and took Galloway's hand. "My name's Zach, and why do people keep calling me that?" "We'll get to that," Galloway said. "But first, you're half right. We did take these from the library. Not all of them, mind you, just the important ones. But we didn't escape out to the swamp. You see, son, these books are magic, and we are using the magic to leave the world behind." "In a ship," Zach said, unimpressed and unconvinced. "In an enchanted ship. There's all kinds of stuff in those books if you keep reading. You can't leave the Earth in a ship. Call it a spaceship if it suits you." "No offense, but you're out of your mind," Zach cracked. The man simply smiled back and waved the younger man to follow him. Reluctantly, Zach laid down the book that he had been holding and followed Galloway through the hallway, up the stairs, and out into the darkness of the foredeck. "Look up and around. Do you see how the stars lie only behind the ship? You see how even the blackened waters are beginning to recede? We're leaving the universe behind, Zach. We're going out beyond the edge. Together, we're going to find the source." He turned to the younger man with a dark look in his eyes. "You're going to help us find that source of everything that left us behind." Zach took a step back and inhaled a deep breath. Yes, the stars had seemed to have all receded to one half of the sky beyond the ship's stern. Yes, the waters looked like they were getting darker, lower, and harder to see. But to be leaving the universe behind? That was impossible. Even if you could somehow get an old ship like this into space, suppose you encapsulated it in an energy field or something, you could never get past the edge of the universe. The universe is expanding at the speed of light, and you'd have to exceed that to even get beyond the furthest point. And from Earth, it'd take almost 14 billion years to get there, by which point it'll have spread at least twice as far. There's no possible way you can get outside the universe. It's just impossible. If you traveled through normal space, of course that'd be impossible, Galloway said slowly, delicately. But those books describe ways of opening up other paths. We're taking a shortcut, Zach. You mean a wormhole, Zach responded. Like a real, functional Einstein-Rosen bridge. Wait. You telling me all the symbols in these books are actually really equations for the construction of interstellar passageways? Believe what you want, Zach. Zach stared at the receding darkness as his mind reeled. He had so many questions, so many avenues of thought to pursue, but there was one question in particular which continued to dog him. Galloway, how did I end up aboard this ship? I mean, one minute I was in a swamp in King's End, and the next you're pulling me up with a net. Well, that's an answer you don't want from me. You'll have to consult. The mansion is full of people now. Or what once were people. My 4 guests can't see them, of course, but I can. Nothing is invisible to me. But one of the 4 men is beginning to see. To really open his eyes and see everything around him. These shades, these ghosts of people who shouldn't be here. He can feel them. He can hear them. And I think, yes, there he is. You can see them now. It's this house, this mansion. It's as if it's reaching into and slowly changing him. It's doing that to all of them. Even if they did leave this place. If the one they freed from the crypt didn't necessitate my preventing them from leaving, their vision would be far wider than they'd ever known before. But the clock is striking midnight on this one, and the ghosts are surrounding him now with their malevolent confusion. Please excuse me a moment. There are only 3 of them now. 3 living souls occupying this place. Unless you count the dog that one of them took in, but the mechanics of that factor are not my expertise. It is odd, though, that the ghosts here are moving so slowly. They're almost perfectly still, as a matter of fact. As if time itself had slowed to a crawl. Well, there's still plenty of time before the event is to happen, so perhaps a continuation of Zach's story will help speed things along. In the gallery, Zach laid out with one of the books beneath the light of a hanging lantern and flipped the tome open. He scanned the pages in search of the word that Galloway had recommended, but found himself lost in the strange symbols and arcane languages that the book contained. If there were complex quantum equations that allowed one to access subspace or even hyperspace, then they were written in a form that he'd never even remotely encountered in his life. And he seriously doubted his ability to decipher them. But Galloway had told him to search out one word. Veritaserin. Zach had little training in Latin, but he knew the root word of veritas, meaning truth, so that was at least a clue towards the answers he needed. Perhaps the word was the first part of a cipher, which would unlock the rest of the book, or perhaps that was the chapter title of a translated portion that could explain what he was experiencing. He stopped about 2/3 of the way through the volume. There was a symbol on the page, and inside, it was the word he sought. The symbol looked like one of those of the impossible drawings by M.C. Escher, like a Mobius strip twisted into the shape of a 7-pointed star with Celtic iconography around it. He flipped around a few adjacent pages, but it was all the same untranslated script, a tangle of strange symbols, nothing relating to the single, elegant Veritaserin page. What the hell am I supposed to do with this? He thought in frustration. He glanced at the floor and something caught his eye. A piece of white chalk. It was wedged in the corner where the wall met the floor. An idea flashed into his head, and he remembered that in some ancient meditation cults, a symbol surrounding a single word mantra was often used to help someone focus and organize their thoughts. In a rush, he scrambled over to the wall, grabbed the chalk, and began scribbling a much larger version of the Mobius star on the rough-hewn wood of the gallery. He worked at it for about 10 minutes, and when he finished, he scrawled the word Veritaserin crudely into the center. "Okay, now I meditate," he said out loud, inwardly adding the pointless word. There was a rustling sound from nearby, and Zach's head flicked reflexively to the spot. Someone had doused the light from the kitchen, leaving it all in shadow. But even in those murky depths, he could see someone slowly moving around the corner. A strange, hulking yet lanky shape with inhumanly disjointed legs. But what struck Zach most was the burning green eyes that glowed in the darkness.
"I am here at your behest."
A voice as smooth as olive oil flowed out from the veiled blackness. "Who are you?" Zach asked. There was no reply for a moment, and then the eyes turned back to the symbol he'd just finished drawing on the wall. Are you Veritaserin?" The thing in the dark let out a slow chuckle.
"No, dear friend, I'm not Veritaserin. I'm merely a colleague."
"Colleague."
"My name's Janus, and you, I believe, are Zachary."
"Zach. How'd you know that?"
"The Veritaserin is a spirit of truth."
Janus responded. He stopped moving as he eyed the one lantern, which had remained lit. He stayed just beyond its reach.
"I am, in some ways, its mouthpiece. Actually, more of somewhat of a translator."
"Were you in the kitchen this whole time, Janus?"
"No. I was wandering to and fro upon Earth."
Zach couldn't see his face, but he could sense a devious playfulness in Janus's voice. And he could only imagine that the strange man was smiling.
"But when you called for the Veritaserin, I found the passage here."
"Called for? Wait, you mean like this summoned you or something?"
Or something.
"And you used quantum tunneling to get here?"
Your questions are tedious. Ask what you really want to know."
"How did I get here? Where is here? And why do these people call me the Link?" Janus huffed.
"I'm impressed. Usually people want to know more about me and my friend." "Very well, let's just skip the formalities."
Again, Zach could sense a smile on this bizarre man's face.
"Before I answer these questions, Zach, you need to have a bit of context. How do you believe that the universe has come to be?"
"The Big Bang," Zach answered without hesitation. "It's been scientifically proven. Astronomers have seen the expansion rate of the universe, and they've noted that the cosmic microwave background..."
"You're correct on the surface,"
Janus responded.
"but in reality, did that occur?"
"What do you... I don't know. I don't know this one, I guess. I'm not sure what you're asking."
"When the one you called God began to create the universe, he did so in the great vacuum that most beings know as the void."
"The Big Bang Theory doesn't require that there be a God."
"I don't care, Zach. Your objection is tangential anyways. The focus of my story is not that what God created, but that which God did not create. As speaking of those nameless entities, which were drifting off in the void before God created the first spark of light. They're mostly unknown to your kind, though some races have come to know and fear such things."
"You're talking about things out in the void before the Big Bang?" Zach asked.
"Yes."
"And these void things, suppose I accept that they're real. What happened to them?"
"They mostly remained out beyond the universe, satisfied with themselves, with a bit of annoyed at the sullen prick of light in the distance. But legend has it, there were two, which willingly entered into a created reality. Two void things that dared enter into God's terrain. One was called Death."
"And the other?" Zach asked after a few moments of silence. His chest was tight and his pulse was racing at the information he was struggling to absorb. Death as an entity which entered reality? Or what the hell could a sibling to that possibly be?
"A name secret even to me."
Janus sighed as he spoke. "So what does this myth have anything to do with this ship? With me?"
"Because you, Zach, dear boy, have been adopted by one of the void things. You have become a son of death.
What does that even mean?
I believe the modern colloquial would be to call you a reaper.
Wait, you're saying I'm a Grim Reaper?
You don't seem so grim to me. I mean, have you seen the Grim Reapers? Skulls for heads, black robes covering their bodies, scythes? I mean, really, a scythe.
These are just myths, Zack objected. The Grim Reaper is just a metaphor to help people grasp the concept of death. Death isn't an actual being, it's just life confronting entropy.
That's a simplistic view of the world,
Janus responded.
But if you're going to stick to rigid empiricism, then accept this. I've seen it. I've seen many Reapers, all adopted by death, tapped to serve its purposes in the universe. The force of entropy may manifest, and you, boy, have become a part of that grand equation. It began in the swamp where you contracted an ancient virus that began to change you. Then, when you died only a short while later, you became a living death, tasked to collecting souls as their bodies start to break down. You are a Reaper, Zack, and the sooner you begin to accept that, the better off you'll be.
This is nonsense. If I'm a Reaper and I'm supposed to be collecting souls for some dark god from outside the universe, then what am I doing on some godforsaken ship traveling beyond the edge of the universe? What? Is this ship taking me to that void thing or whatever?
No, this ship is on a mission of destruction. They seek out the void things, reasons only known to insane humankind. But on their way out of reality, they perform the spell.
And?
It was a spell to catch a Reaper. You see, Death, the Grand Master Death, resides inside the universe, but they intended to travel outside of the universe. They needed a link, a lifeline to pull themselves back in case things go as they're going to. And if a Reaper is still connected to his father. So basically your umbilical is the anchor line. That's why they call you the link.
Zack stumbled sideways and collapsed into a chair. I think I need a drink, he said as he buried his head in his hands. Janus sighed from his shadowy kitchen.
Everyone thinks they're ready for the truth. They call upon the Vartazarman. But no one seems to understand the consequences. The first time they summoned us here, they were doomed. That is the cost of the truth he contains.
What the hell does that mean?
The Vartazarman,
Janus repeated, as if Zack had gotten lost that early.
like I told you, is the spirit of truth. It's not a malevolent being bent on human destruction, and yet destruction always lies in its wake. It's like being supernaturally radioactive. It has a corrupted influence on fate and destiny. So when the two of us come together, everyone usually comes to a cold and bitter end.
What are you exactly? The spirit of translation or something? This is freaking ridiculous.
Some would call me a demon. But I have no qualms with your kind, Zack. You're not human. Well, not anymore. What's the matter? Are demons and reapers really contrary to what you're willing to believe?
Not entirely, I guess. It's just that there's no evidence of them.
Are you saying there's no evil or death in the world?
Well, yeah, of course there are, but there are explainable causes for them. Janus laughed underneath his breath, but then stopped.
Well, as much as I love standing here and debating philosophy with toddler Death, I'm afraid I have some advice that you're not going to like. You need to kill these sailors, Zack. For their own good. They need to die.
What? I can't kill these people, Zack responded aggressively.
It's easy for you. All you gotta do is think it and call out for them. Their names will form in your mind. Their bodies will die, but their souls will gather to you for guidance.
I'm not asking how to kill them, I'm saying I won't do it.
Then You'll hear them
Janus's voice was drowned out by a cry up on deck. Startled, curious, and desperate to emancipate himself from the entity in the kitchen, Zach darted down the hallway and up the stairs to the source of the cries. The sailors were all pressing themselves against the gunwales and looking overboard. The man with the handlebar mustache was standing beside the one in the fisherman's hat, and Galloway was standing beside the fat man in the striped shirt on the other side. The fat man's belly was pressing through the bars, but he and his companion stepped back as something small and black slithered over the rail and onto the deck. It was long and serpentine, but with a jumble of legs pointing in all directions. Without hesitation, the man in the fisherman's hat swung around and stomped onto the pitchy thing, which only made a crunch but otherwise let out no sound. Behind them, however, Zach could see larger bodies floating by, strange and shimmering black, making the men look minuscule in comparison. The other men spun around, and further out into the dark they could see. Only 2 of the men left. I went ahead and claimed another one of them while I was telling you that story. I'd say I hope that's not too disconcerting to you, but honestly, I don't care. I do, however, feel bad for one mistake that I made. One of the 2 remaining men saw me. I've been watching from a room at the top of the stairs, and one of them glanced up and saw me as I checked my pocket watch. It was my mistake, my own stupid, careless mistake, but it was so quick that I think nothing will come of it. If anything, he'll assume I'm one of the ghosts that haunt this dark home. Some ways of thinking, he wouldn't be incorrect. The 2 men are alone in the parlor, a single candle lit on a nearby table. Beside the candle rests a sleek blue handgun with the words "Backlash" etched into its grip. One of the men is trembling, and his eyes are roving back and forth between his empty palms and the weapon on the table, while the man who saw me is standing in alarm. I flick open my pocket watch again. The time is so close now, mere minutes away. But it's not here yet. Galloway went bustling down into the gallery, his trench coat swishing behind him dramatically as he ran. The man with the handlebar mustache followed behind him, but the rest stayed on the deck, ignoring Zach, who was entranced by the enormous, amorphous forms that glided by in the dark. There were no more waters now, no more stars, just the faint light of lanterns on the ship's deck reflecting off the oily black skin of hideous forms that floated like whales in the outer dark. Janus, the so-called demon referred to as the Void. There was a sound like horses' hooves clopping away slowly across the deck. Zach turned to see an unnaturally tall man with shaggy black hair over a naked body appear to his right. The man, if a man he was, had hooves instead of feet, and horns sprouting from his head, looking with his olive-hued skin less like the quintessential devil and more like an overgrown satyr. Zach couldn't initially tear his eyes from Janus's glowing green ones, but the dark forms in the void grew ever larger and ever closer, and soon he found his eyes flickering back and forth between the 2.
The time's growing short.
Janus said in his same low, smooth voice.
You gotta kill them, Zachary.
I won't do it,
You're a reaper!
Janus barked.
You'll be claiming lives for a millennia, if not an eternity. And a merciful end is a good way of starting. Now do it!
I can't, Zach stammered. I'm a scientist, not a murderer. Janus let out a sigh that floated in the air like a ball of hot air.
Then as a scientist, you pay attention to what happens next. Goodbye, my friend.
With that, Janus turned back to the gallery and walked down the corridor, which began to glow a strange orange color. As he came near, he passed by one of the old tomes one of the men had dropped as they fled below deck. The movement was so subtle that Zach couldn't be sure, but it almost seemed like Janus cringed at the book in both disgust and fear. Then he passed through the orange glowing doorway and vanished from sight. One of the men screamed from nearby. Zach spun around just in time for the cry to vanish over the lip of the gunwale, as if one of the men had leapt overboard. The fat man in the striped shirt was pressing his back against the mast, and not far beyond him, the man in the fisherman's hat was huddled down on the inside of a railing, curled up in the fetal position. A glance beyond him told Zach why. The shapes of the void were moving closer and closer, some of them even brushing against the side of the ship, causing it to shake violently as if they'd all been hit by a whale. Swarms of smaller black things zoomed towards the lights, knocking some of the lanterns to the deck where their own light was overcome by the small creatures. There was another jarring sound and then a squish, as some gelatinous thing had smacked into the bow of the ship. A few seconds later, dark tendrils began slithering up and over the gunwale, feeling blindly about. Zack stepped back in horror when some of these latched onto the man in the fisherman's hat. They wrapped around his wrists and pulled him to his feet. Then thicker tendrils wrapped around his throat and waist. Some of these opened up to reveal sharpened teeth that sank into his flesh. The man began to scream, but before Zack had a chance to reach him, the man was pulled out into the dark and soon lost, though his screams could still be heard. Please, 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 the man with the striped shirt muttered to himself as an elongated form spun toward him like a drill, shooting from a direction Zack hadn't noticed. This wrapped around the man's arm and pulled him into the air above the ship, where other forms latched onto his other limbs. And soon, a whole crowd of amorphous forms were fighting for him, all claws and teeth and tentacles. His shirt began to rip, and then worse things started falling from the sky in tune with the man's screams. But even when so many fell that the man must surely have been dead, he continued to gibber as he, too, was pulled out into the shadows beyond the ship. Zack was about to duck down below the deck when part of the ship suddenly exploded outward, and he saw the man with the handlebar mustache being dragged away by some great lumbering thing, claws sunk into his chest, blood pooling from his nose, and impossibly screaming mouth as the darkness overcame him. The shape swirled around and shot for the lights, yet even in the dark Zack could see that none of the things were going after him. They had taken the others, had ripped them to pieces, had gnawed the flesh from their bones, and yet it was as if none of them even noticed that Zack existed. They were treating him like the way they treated each other. That was when he finally realized that was what Janus told him was the truth. He'd been adopted by one of these hideous monstrosities, and as such, he was now immune to them, and granted a small facsimile of their power, which meant that he still had a chance to save Galloway, or rather, to rescue Galloway from the fate of his fellow sailors. Zack raced below deck and found Galloway in the gallery, his back pressed against the wall, across which Zack had drawn the symbol to summon Veritaserin. The symbol was smeared now, faded as if it had been drawn 100 years rather than 20 minutes ago. The other wall of the gallery had been totally removed by the thing that had made off with the man with the handlebar mustache, and beyond it, a multitude of forms all swam by like nightmarish fish in an aquarium. For a moment, he saw yet another sailor being dragged away from his perch on the upper deck, but this man was laughing maniacally as he disappeared. All vestiges of sanity burned away. He cackled like a hyena, even as blood poured from his mouth and a wound in his chest. And then the darkness had him, took him away, leaving only his laugh behind. Galloway's eyes locked on Zack as a great mass bubbled in through the hole in the wall. This was not like the others. It glowed with its own interior luminescence. Bubbles formed and popped and reformed incessantly all over it. It looked more like a tidal wave of glowing sludge than any real living organism, and yet it moved like a predator, quickly flooding around Galloway's ankles, which immediately began to smoke and steam. Galloway screamed as the glowing mass rose up to his knees and slowly continued to his waist. Fumbling, he reached beneath his coat and drew out his revolver, then pointed it at his own head. "They don't want you," he stammered, his energy ebbing rapidly away. "But neither can they have me." He pulled the trigger, and blood and brains splattered against the wall behind him. But he was still alive, and conscious, and aware. He pointed the gun again at his head at a different angle and pulled the trigger. More blood, more brains, no death. Zack looked at him, concentrated, thinking his name, trying desperately to end his suffering and call his soul toward him. But on some deep, dark, cold level, he knew it was too late. It was too late for Galloway and his men to die. Galloway screamed as the mass moved across him, and then the screams were muffled as he was consumed by it completely. The ship began to shudder and break apart. Terrified, his heart racing faster than ever had before, even among the reptiles in the swamp, Zack sprinted up towards the top deck, took one last look at the collapsing, overrun ship, and then leapt into the empty darkness, swarming with the others of his father's kind. Zack wandered, floating in the dark as the men continued to scream around him. You could never see them, could never find them, but he could always hear their cries. At some points, he nearly lost his own mind, and began at others to wonder if the screams were real or merely etched so powerfully into his memory that they just seemed real. But regardless, they were still there, still crying at him from the dark, and after a long while, when he could no longer bear to hear them, he located the tiny pinprick of light in the far-off distance, and felt his connection to the one who waited there, and followed it back to created reality. Once back in the universe, Zack wandered the dark corridors of space and time. He huddled in corners beyond men's perception, shaking in fear when he thought back on the sailors he'd refused to save, and eventually, he came into the full acceptance of his role. He was a Reaper, culled from humanity and destined to claim the lives and souls of his own kind. There were ancient battles where Reapers gathered by the hundreds, and Zack met his brothers and sisters on those fields. There were terrified mortals dying of horrible diseases, to whom Zack showed mercy as he guided them on to what lay beyond. And there were days, strange, far-off eons, when even Reapers lost their power. Zack feared those days, feared the truth that someday even his adoptive father would die. But until that day came, his father still had work for him to do. Oh, how different things could have been. These two men hadn't opened the crypt. They released the Veritaserum, you see, and even now I can feel it wandering in this now doomed town. Long after I'm done here, I will have to return and reap this town, sparing a young man who will flee into the swamp, and, after untold spans of time, accept his role as me. Everything. The rising dead, the ship beyond the universe, my transformation. All of it could have been avoided if the Veritaserum had been left alone. But then I wouldn't have come here in the first place. Time is funny that way. The men are fighting now, of course, and all it takes for me is a casual thought to roll the candle into the drapes. Now the house is burning around the two men as they wrestle for that gun. I know the fates of both men have been corrupted, but as I did with Galloway, I can choose to let one of them live. I made a mistake with Galloway. As I turn over the pocket watch in my hand, I can't help but wonder, well, should I make that mistake again?